Fauchagoo, ye Olde Scots the Celtic podcast, Independence Day special. Instead of a bunch of fireworks and burnt hot dogs, today's podcast will tell you of the deep connection the Scotch, Irish, and Celts alike have with America's independence on both sides. The Celtic people brought their fortunes, politics, music, and superstitions with them to live or fight in this new world, while some showed up as slaves. So we're going to treat this day with the deep reverence and respect it deserves. Enjoy. Amazing Grace. Now, the song that I feebly tried to play on my tin whistle at the intro is Amazing Grace. Ironically, this stirring song, closely associated with the African American community, was written by a former enslaver, John Newton, who was inspired by a near-death experience and sentiments about the American colonial uprising which loomed in his future. Newton was born in 1725 in London to a Puritan mother who died 2 weeks before his 17th birthday, and a stern sea captain father who took him to sea at age 11 upon a slave ship. Now, Newton's life story varies from a licentious libertine in the British Navy to his religious conversion and, of course, taking up the abolitionist cause. During a voyage home on one trip upon a slave ship, the ship was caught in a horrendous storm off the coast of Ireland and almost sank. Newton prayed to God for all to make it back safely. The cargo miraculously shifted, filled a hole in the ship's hull, and the vessel drifted ashore, and everybody was saved. Newton took this as a sign from the Almighty and marked it as his conversion to Christianity. Now, his thoughts about slavery would evolve over time, although he continued to invest in the slave business. He suffered a stroke in 1754 and was forced to retire. In 1764, he was ordained as an Anglican priest, and he wrote 280 hymns to accompany his services. You see, at the time he used to recuperate from his stroke, he used to become a priest and learn to read and write again, reading the Bible and writing hymns. Now, he wrote the words for Amazing Grace in 1772, but it was not until 1788, 34 years after leaving it, that he renounced his former slave profession by publishing a blazing pamphlet called Thoughts About the Slave Trade. Now, in 1835, William Walker put the words to the popular tune New Britain, and the rest is history. So, enjoy a real version of Amazing Grace. Scottish slavery in America. Now, Scots, they have this deep-seated hatred for English. Not all of them, but I still do, a lot of them. And they have right to be, but not be vocal about it as much these days. But if you study the Scots' history with the English, then you have more than enough examples as to why. And this is just one of many. Now, as many as 500 Scottish POWs captured at the battles of Worcester or Dunbar were shipped to New England in the 1650s as slaves to work in iron mills, sawmills, and farms. But they were just the beginning. I know 500 doesn't sound like much, but remember, the population of the American colonies in 1650 was only 50,368 people. The first settlement in Jamestown was really only about 41 years old. The Great Migration of Puritans had ended, and the colonists badly needed workers. Across the sea, Oliver Cromwell's new government had the costly and vexing task of managing thousands of Scottish POWs. The best solution presented for the Scottish POW problem was to deport them as slaves to New England. Now, Virginia and Barbados as well. But now, some of the Scottish POWs sent to New England were sold as a group to work in the Saugus ironworks of the sawmills and of Berwick, Maine. Others went to York as servants, and still others were sold individually. Now, the Puritan minister, John Cotton, defended the practice when he wrote, "The Scots who God delivered into our hands at Dunbar, and were of sundry, were sent hither. We have been desirous as we could to make their yoke easy. Such as were sick of scurvy and other diseases have not wanted the physic and surgery. They have not been sold for slaves to perpetual servitude, but for 6, 7, or 8 years, as we do what they call indentured servants." Now, by the way, this is where that term indentured servants comes from. As one historian noted dryly, though, Cotton deadened the New England's conscience, and the records of the time showed that his 6, 7, or 8 years was more like a death sentence, given the grueling, hard, long work that the Scottish slaves were forced to endure. Now, Cromwell, he executed King Charles I in January of 1649, and the Scottish people had sided with Cromwell, but they turned on Cromwell and declared Charles's son king. In the summer of 1650, Cromwell and his forces then invaded Scotland. The Scottish Parliament, in response, conscripted thousands of young Scottish men between the ages of 19 and 25, though some were as young as 12. They clashed at the short but brutal Battle of Dunbar, and within an hour, 12,000 parliamentarians, battle-hardened, experienced soldiers defeated 11,000 Scots, who were mostly farmers and tradesmen, killing as many as 2,000 while losing only 20 men. Cromwell's army released thousands of sick and wounded Scots, but then marched the remaining Scottish POWs like cattle to Durham, 100 miles away. Now, many perished of hunger or disease on the forced march. Though a few did escape, most were just simply executed. Now, in Durham, the English imprisoned the Scottish POWs in the castle and cathedral. About 1,600 of them died of dysentery, disease, or starvation due to the horrific conditions there. The English had them buried in mass graves, which the English denied until a recent discovery of the mass graves. Now, 2 months after the battle, 150 Scottish POWs were boarded on the ship Unity and sailed to London. Then, to Charleston, Massachusetts. The shipmaster, Augustine Walker, paid £5 for each man and then sold them for 20 to 30 pounds. Technically, they signed contracts agreeing to the indentured servitude, but in reality, most spoke only Gaelic and were illiterate. So, about 50 of them went to the Saugus Ironworks, the first successful ironworks in the colonies. Now, it produced much-needed iron bars for tools, building materials, and cooking implements. But the Scottish POWs worked 16-hour days, 7 days a week, at hard, dangerous labor on very little sustenance. They worked as woodcutters to supply the wood to make charcoal, or as forge hands, blacksmiths, miners, and farmhands. Another 25 Scottish POWs were taken to the Nwechiwannock River, now the Salmon Falls River, in Berwick, Maine. They went with an Englishman named Richard Leader, who got hold of an abandoned mill. Leader put the Scottish laborers to work sawing Maine white pine trees, which he sold. They were needed very badly for the British Navy. Valentine Hill also bought some of the Scottish POWs from the Battle of Dunbar and worked them as in his sawmills at Durham Falls and the Lamprey River in New Hampshire. Exactly 1 year after the Battle of Dunbar, Cromwell's much larger force defeated 16,000 mostly Scottish army at Worcester, England. It was the last battle of the English Civil War. 3,000 men died in battle, and 10,000 were taken prisoner. According to tradition, the English lined up the Scottish POWs in order to shoot every 10th man. A Highlander named Mickham McIntyre saw his number would soon be up, and he broke rank and ran for his life. A horseman chased him down and wounded him, but spared his life. The English then drove the Scottish POWs like cattle, without rest or food, into London. Now, a witness described them, the Scottish POWs, as all of them were stripped, many of them cut, some with stockings or shoes, and scarce so much left upon them as to cover their nakedness. They ate peas and handfuls of straws in their hands, which they had pulled upon the fields as they passed. In London, the English confined them outdoors on artillery fields. Again, many died of disease, starvation, and exposure, while the government debated what to do with them. About 275 Scottish POWs were sent to Boston about the John and Sarah, which is a ship, where Thomas Kemble, a Charleston merchant, took them on consignment. Now, Kemble found a ready market among planters and mill owners for the human cargo. As the news spread about the first shipment of Scottish POWs, so when the second shipment arrived, Kemble easily sold the Scottish POWs in many of the Massachusetts towns. Kemble sold others in New Hampshire and Durham, too, where he partnered with Valentine Hill. So many ended up in York, Maine, that for years, and the town had the nickname of Scotland. Daniel Black, who came over on the John and Sarah, probably got sold to the son of Reverend Zechariah Sims, one of the Charleston's most prominent citizens. In 1654, Black assaulted and beat up his master, and a court sent him to prison in 1654. Black apparently left prison, married, and had children. And New York Governor Frank S. Black traced his ancestry to the Scottish POW. The Scottish POWs were all still of marriageable age when they got freed from their bondage, those that survived, of course, and many did marry. Some married the Irish housemaids, who were also brought over here to the colonies as slaves. Few ever returned home to Scotland. Most Scottish slaves died during their servitude, whether it be the mines, logging, or any other number of dangerous jobs given to them here in America. They were considered the really lucky ones because their suffering had ended. Only a small percentage of Scots prior to 1700 ended up marrying the boss's daughter or received land grants. Most who survived their time of servitude were scorned by everyone, viewed as the same or less than blacks or Indians. Now, these Scots would parse out a meager existence for years to come, or take any chance at a better life. Scots fought in every war that came along, and many went off into the unknown lands of America as trappers, hunters, and explorers. They survived, and when the next wave of Scots came to American shores, they had um, a, a little bit of a better welcome because of the hard work and the respect that those that had come before them had built. See, the Scottish POWs that came over here and managed to survive their servitude, which was few, went on to do great things and become great people, and therefore built that respect so that the later waves of Scottish immigrants and Irish immigrants who came over here had it better. Irish men and women came to America early in colonial history, seeking adventure in a new world and asylum from the old. The plantation of Ulster by England's Queen Elizabeth in the 16th century drove 500,000 Irish Protestants across the sea, and these disenfranchised exiles faithfully kept the fires of resentment burning in their new home. Indentured servants and prosperous businessmen alike settled in American coastal cities in ever-growing numbers. When independence was declared, Irish Americans turned out in force. As many as 1/3 to 1/2 of American Revolutionary War troops were Irish, and besides an unquenchable thirst for freedom and the will to fight for it, these early immigrants also brought their music. "Johnny Has Gone for a Soldier" is one of many popular Revolutionary War songs descended from Irish airs. It was originally Shula Gra, which translates "Step Out My Love," and is also known as Shula Rún. This was a popular battlefield song sung among the Irish revolutionaries.
Oh, I wish I were on yon green hill, there I'd sit and cry my fill, and every tear would turn a mill. For Johnny has gone for a soldier. Shul, 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 shul go sicker, agus shul go pune, shul go lost, agus sell Eden dune. Ish go death of onin schlang. We'll sell our clock, we'll sell our reel, we'll sell our only spinning wheel to buy our love a sword of steel. For Johnny has gone for a soldier. Shul, 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 shul go sicker, agus shul go pune, shul go lost, agus sell Eden dune. Ish go dead of onin song.
Shul, shul, shularun, shul go sucker, agus shul go cune. sakura ge shuga kyun shul katar sag selila his kachay tum falling slow I wish I was on yonder hill to stare right sit and cry my fear till every tear would turn a leer. I'll sell my rod, I'll sell my reel, I'll sell my only spinning wheel to buy my love a sword of steel. Shul, shul, shularun, shul go sakura ge shuga kyun, shul katar sag selila his kajay tu mo fornins I'll dye my petticoats, I'll dye them red, and round the world I'll beg my bread until my parents shall wish me dead. Shul, shul, shularun, shul ka sakura ge shuga kyun, shul katar sag selila his kajay tu mo fornins Shul, shularun, shul ka sakura ge shuga kyun, shul katar sag selila Shul, shularun, shul ka sakura ge shuga kyun, shul katar sag selila his kajay tu mo fornins
Patriotic Ghosts. More patriots' lives were lost aboard British prison ships anchored along New York's East River than in the battles. Between 8,000 to 12,000 died while prisoners of war versus the approximate 6,800 killed in battle. Lost souls included not only American soldiers and sailors, but citizens who just opposed the British crown. Those that were of Scottish, Irish, or British descent received the worst treatment because they were seen as traitors to their country. Overcrowded in the dark lower decks of the ships, prisoners roasted in sizzling temperatures, drank brackish water supplied through the sides of the ship, starved and quarreled with vermin, lice, impending madness, dehydration, and contagious disease. Alexander Coffin Jr., an 18-year-old sailor imprisoned on the infamous HMS Jersey, wrote, "I soon found that every spark of humanity had fled the breasts of the British officers who had charge of that floating receptacle of human misery, and that nothing but abuse and insult was to be expected. The bodies of many who perished were simply tossed overboard, leaving remains to gradually wash up along Brooklyn shore. Others were buried in shallow graves on the beaches. For years after the abandonment of the ghastly vessels, Brooklynites collected exposed remains of those tortured prisoners for proper burial within a crypt in Brooklyn's Fort Greene Park to, honor their memory. Now, despite efforts to preserve the memory of those lost aboard ship, some souls remained without peace. In October of 1902, laborers at the Brooklyn Navy Yard stumbled upon the sunken hull of the Jersey, accidentally piercing it while extending one of the docks. Soon after, nearby residents reported strange activities, including that of faint whispers near the water, ancient tunes whistling through the air, and murmurs of language only spoken in the recesses of the old country. So beware. Next time you're walking along New York's northwest shore, you may be greeted by the lingering souls of the steadfast patriots whose dreams were abruptly sunk in lives that were unbearably lost.
Gaidhlig am bhaith mi, Gaidhlig am bhaith mi, Gaidhlig am bhaith mi, Dod chroi hanum mi, Grauna me, Mahula vidi buacheliach, Get huadun je maaf na bula me, Gaidhlig grachi mar huadun me. Guardian, sa tjarna gedish na fadhian, gan hachet fleskach bij alvun, schad hiereboon gachastes doen. Get wedig to krauw agus kericho, get wedig to echo Get veder to shen agus dunje go, Gaidhlig gachi mar hudun mi. Troti mahet sma vahet ut, Troti ma hinjig sma harsten doet, ach maraib ma hut veraden nu, but it chich me gachi mar hanem mi. Jou ma vahet goen harsko, jou wie de penje boede go, is jou wie bedacht an nuur harsko, ma hitch me gachi mar goeden mi.
This last piece is a little bit long, 16 minutes, but it's well worth it. I put a lot of effort into writing this piece, and I hope you like it. But I put it at the end, that way, you don't have to sit through a whole bunch of stuff to get to the meat of it. You can come back to it later. Hope you all enjoy your Independence Day, and hope you all enjoyed the Independence Day podcast. Martian Leavendrozda. Bye for now. Scotland and the American Revolution. When thinking about the impact Scots and other Celts had on the American Revolution, one is struck by the extent to which Scotland and the Scots informed and supported American independence. From the presence of Scots in Congress, to the influence of common sense moral philosophy, to the influence of the Declaration of Arbroath on the Declaration of Independence, Scots were, are, and credited with a disproportionate impact on American independence. The inconvenient truth for most Americans of Scottish heritage is that 18th century Scots largely disavowed the American Revolution. In both Scotland and America, the overwhelmingly majority of Scots rejected colonial theories about the rights of Englishmen and remained loyal to the British Crown. Scottish immigrants, more often than not, became loyalists and participated in large numbers in the armed provincial regiments. And such loyalty may seem bizarre. The general theory that the Scots had been beaten into submission at Culloden and the preceding Highland clearances is only partly correct. There are various reasons for which I will try to explain. As with most significant events in history, Scottish reactions to the Revolution must be understood within the grand scheme of things. The union of the crowns in 1603, which saw James VI of Scotland become James I of Great Britain, profoundly shifted the cultural, political scene of the British Isles. James, whose predecessors in Scotland had typically been either killed off in coups, rebellions, or on the battlefield, ascended to a much stronger, stable, and powerful English state, and wanted to unite the parliaments of Scotland and England under his leadership. James saw the economic troubles in the north as a way to have a bloodless coup as to bring the two nations together and therefore further his interests. The interest of the parliamentarians on both sides of the border prevented this from happening now during his reign, and left James an important legacy in which the idea of a united Britain was as much a Scottish aspiration for equality as it was an English desire to solidify power and influence. During the British Civil Wars of the 1640s, the idea of Britain developed as parliamentarians in Scotland and England found common cause in their opposition to monarchical absolutism. It was the Scots who sparked the war when they took up arms to resist the imposition of a Book of Common Prayer. Many Scots believed that Charles I's efforts to enforce religious conformity over his kingdoms was an attempt to destroy Presbyterianism and introduce Church of England's Anglicanism into a nation highly suspicious of high church doctrines. The Scottish invasion of England in 1638 and their occupation of Newcastle forced Charles to recall the English Parliament, thus sparking the English Civil War. In that subsequent conflict, the Scots were an aggressive party, demanding that English parliamentarians adopt Presbyterianism in England in return for Scottish military support against the king. Under pressure, the English Parliament agreed and signed the Solemn League and Covenant of 1643. But in the British context, at least, Presbyterians did not make good revolutionaries. While among the first to challenge the rights of the king, the Scots were appalled by the execution of Charles I in 1649, and immediately installed his son as Charles II. Oliver Cromwell's subsequent invasion and occupation of Scotland was brutal, but Scottish loyalty to the monarchy had become so well entrenched it wasn't going anywhere. Scotland had a long history of engagement with England on more complex levels than just the resistance of English oppression. Even some of the most patriotic Scots looked to England for guidance. Scotland in the late 17th century was, despite its impressive levels of education, appeared to outsiders to still be an underdeveloped and often backward nation. Now, looking south, Scots saw a centralized state, relative stability, Newtonian science, political philosophers, greater enfranchisement, and after 1689, a constitutional, circumscribed monarchy. The desire to be a part of this was clear, and in 1707, Scottish parliaments, after realizing that the nation's wealth would not permit her to compete in colonial ventures on the European stage, and England's willingness to subvert Scotland's economy and hold her neighbor to the north hostage, well, they signed the Treaty of Union, which unified the parliaments of Scotland and England. Now, it took a long time for Scotland to witness the benefits of the Union. Major Jacobite rebellions in support of the deposed House of Stuart, which had been replaced as part of the Revolutionary Settlement of 1689, broke out in 1715 and 1745. After the British forcibly subdued the rebellious Scottish Highlanders with the brutal clearances, slowly over time the advantages of union became clearer and drew Scotland firmly within British political sphere. Now, first, the economic benefits began to emerge as the Treaty of Union opened up English markets to Scottish traders. The increased burden of taxation as a result of the Union did provoke some riots. One in 1725, the Porteous Riots of 36, and the infamous excise tax right of 1733. But Scotland was largely spared the levels of taxation seen in England, and as a result benefited economically from the Union. Under the Navigation Acts, which really frustrated American traders, Scots were permitted to carry on trade with British colonies without paying the tariffs associated with foreign states, because they were now part of Britain. The biggest beneficiary, of course, was Glasgow, which overtook centers such as London and Liverpool to become Britain's leading tobacco port in the 1770s. Now, second, Scots were philosophically aware of how much they had benefited from the union with England. The economic transformation of Scotland was accompanied by a transformation in science, literature, philosophy, and newspaper circulation. This was the age of the Scottish Enlightenment, and a time in which many of the most sophisticated theories in science of man were emanating from Scotland. As a result, Scots began to seriously question the success of their nation as an independent historical entity and began to see its fate bound up with that of England. Scots even took to calling themselves North Britons and went so far as to disavow their own past. By 1750, it was hard to find a Scot who openly would argue that Scottish institutions were as capable as the British. Now, this did not mean that enlightened Scots simply copied the English institutions, but it is fair to say that many Scots borrowed from the languages of English in an attempt to rewrite Scotland's place in the world. Third, the larger British state was far more capable of offering employment to the Scots than the small Scottish state. The biggest source for employment proved to be the armies of the British state and the East India Company. Thousands of Scots entered into the British armed forces, and some benefited significantly from this. This was particularly evident in the Scottish Highlands, which linguistically and culturally divided it from the rest of Scotland. Now, where the Jacobite rebellions had typically gained their most determined support as well. Now, from bitter opponents of British state interference in the early 18th century, the Highlands emerged as a leading supplier of manpower for Britain's armies in the 1760s. Highland soldiers would fight in both the French and Indian War and the War of American Independence. While many officers of these regiments did not agree with colonial arguments for independence, they fought more for the economic and social benefits of service than anything else. The level of money and patronage coming into the Highlands as a result of government expenditures on the military was impressive. By the 1770s, even junior officers could retire on half pensions and have more than enough to run a small farm. Now finally, The political benefits of union permitted Scots to take a leading role in the creation of British power. From the 1760s especially, Scottish politicians were among the leading figures in Parliament. In 1762, John Stuart, 3rd Earl of Bute, became the first Scot to become Prime Minister of Great Britain. He was joined by a coterie of figures who would help him guide policy during the imperial crisis. Alexander Wedderburn from East Lothian served as the Solicitor General and the Attorney General during the American War of Independence and was an unrepentant critic of colonial rights. It was Wedderburn who was chiefly responsible for the incendiary attack upon Benjamin Franklin before the Privy Council in January of 1774, in which Franklin was accused of being the prime conductor of agitation against Britain. Wow. Not every Scot was a keen supporter of British imperial power, though. The dividing line seemed to fall between Highland Scots and Lowland Scots. In addition to John Paul Jones, probably the best-known Scot to serve in the armed forces of Congress, we can add the names of Arthur St. Clair from Caithness, Hugh Mercer from Aberdeenshire, Alexander MacDougall from Inslee, Lachlan Mackintosh from Badenoch, and New York-born William Alexander, who claimed Scottish title of Lord Stirling, all of whom served as generals in the Continental Army. Nevertheless, on balance, for every Scot in the service of Congress, there were dozens who served the crown. The benefits of being allied to the British state and the long tradition of benefiting from engagement with England was a crucial factor in the anti-revolutionary stance taken by many Scots, both in the colonies and in the British Isles. Now, indeed, one theme of considerable importance to the role of Scots in the Revolution is the perception of Scots among the revolutionary generation. Colonial Americans looked to England for their political cues, and it is therefore not surprising that Americans should also have been infected with a distasteful contempt for the Scots. In the 1760s, John Wilkes had gained a large anti-establishment following in England, based in large measure on his denunciations of Bute and other Scots. To many Englishmen, the arrival of Scottish politicians forebode the corruption of their state into clannishness, Toryism, and tyranny. Now, Americans borrowed from this language and molded it in their concerns over the corruption of political virtues in the British Constitution. In 1746, for example, Americans had widely celebrated the defeat of the Scottish Jacobites. By the 1770s, American revolutionaries laid the blame for the major faults of parliamentary rule firmly at the door of the Scots. Now, it was the Scots who were purportedly leading English rulers down a path of confrontation with their fellow nationals in the colonies. The Scots, it was said, were the contrivers and supporters of all measures against you. Nor will they ever desist while the English have a penny to be plundered or a man sacrificed. Seems like the Scots were the whipping boy for everybody. An address to the inhabitants of the American colonies declared that the righteousness of the colonial cause would be vindicated in battles against the British. Their principal muscular strength at present consists then in a number of mercenary, hackneyed, tattered regiments, patched up by the most abandoned and debauched of mankind, the scum of the nation, the dregs of Irish and Scottish desperadoes. Wow. If these were the attitudes toward Scots present at the highest levels of the revolutionary leadership, the idea that Scottish support for the revolution was widespread must be treated with some suspicion. Now, the only thing left to ask is why Scotland had been the focus of so much attention with regards to support of the American Revolution. It is clear that Scottish philosophy did have a role in developing common sense moral codes and the belief that society could be improved by elevating cause and effect. It was under Aberdeen's own William Small that Jefferson received his undergraduate education at the College of William and Mary. In some respects, American independence was one of the towering achievements of the applied Enlightenment. On the other hand, Scottish philosophers were only one small group among many influencers on American revolutionaries. Perhaps it is the case that Scottish philosophers had a greater role in influencing the subsequent development of the early republic rather than influencing initial support for independence. People rarely make a decision based solely on their nationality or their ethnic heritage. It is interesting to note that those Scots who had lived in the colonies for long periods and were familiar with colonial politics tended to support the revolution, even in areas of loyalism. Now, they supported the revolution not because they were Scots. They supported the revolution because they believed in the potential of the revolution to challenge the corruption of the old world and turn its back on the constraints of aristocracy and privilege. And surely that was the whole point of the revolution. Thomas Paine had put it most clearly in 1776, "We have it in our power to begin the world over again." As far as the role of ethnic identity in the American Revolution is concerned, an old 18th century adage goes, just because one is born in a stable doesn't make one a horse. And that's equally valid.